looking at macroeconomics in Latin America is always an interesting and varying topic. And interestingly, we have three panelists that not only have a wealth of experience in Latin America, but they also have a wealth of experience outside of Latin America. So they can give us some perspective about Latin America relative to the rest of the world. And I thought I would start with a very general question and give the three of them a chance.
Put the mic closer. Closer.
Okay. Ready? I was afraid that if I put it too close, I actually sing, so I have a baritone voice, and all of you will be sort of deaf after a while. So now tell me if it's too loud. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pose a very general question, and I'm going to give the three panelists a chance to answer and complement their answers. And the question is as follows. When you look at macroeconomics, we're always in between hope on one side and fear on the other side. and the question I want to make is, if you look at Latin America for the next decade, which are the trends, issues, challenges that give you hope, and which are the issues that give you some fear? And where is your personal barometer between fear and hope? Why don't we start with Manuel and sort of come in this direction?
Hello. How are you? Nice being here. Hope and fear. Well, I'm in the investment world, so we have more hope than fear most times. Thinking about Latin America, if you really look at Latin America over the last 20, 30 years, Latin America has grown almost every decade, except the 80s, the 90s, 2000 to 2010, at an average of 3%. So it's very stable, in fact. You see, which is not very good, because growing at 3% in our situation is not enough. And if we look from 2010 till today, we are growing at around 2%. So the hope is not only that Latin America can grow better than 3%. We did grow better before the crisis of 2008, 9 in Latin America, 7 and 8 here. The fear always is something can go wrong. I think that we have had over the last 30 years, everything that can go wrong in Latin America has gone wrong, so it doesn't scare me that much. The latest, since the 2000s, where the fear is that something goes wrong outside of Latin America. We already faced something going wrong in the US and Europe, and I think that we passed that test, so that doesn't scare me that much, and I don't think it's the situation right now. China is clearly what scares me if that doesn't go wrong. And why China? Is because if you take Mexico out, 80 plus percent of what Latin America exports are commodities, and has a lot to do with China, India, and global growth in general. And second, for most of Latin America, ex-Mexico is the biggest trading partner. So that's, I would say, the biggest fear. Then there is, every year there is something to worry about, but that's, I think, is the major one that I would mention.
I think for me, hope, I'm looking at it. It's you guys. When you go back to your countries and you start changing those countries, I think that is the biggest hope. And with it comes the biggest fear. Because if you look at what's going on in Latin America today, you have countries that are trying to break away from a pattern. And I'm thinking here about Brazil, what Judge Sergio Moro is doing in Brazil, breaking down this pattern of corruption that has been endemic in every one of our countries, that has prevented people from moving up the social ladder, that has created this level of poverty and immunity that has persisted for centuries in the region. So I totally agree with Manuel. It's stable growth, 2-3%, but this is too little. This is way too little. And the way to change it, we have to change so many things in Latin America. So when I think about hope, I think this is the previous panel was talking about entrepreneurs. Some of the problems with entrepreneurship, I mean, we can talk about that for quite a while. But I think the biggest hope that I have is that Latin America is going to break away from this mode of corruption, of nepotism, of countries that don't grow. And my biggest fear is that we have too few people trying to do it. So if it's Sergio Moro in Brazil, it's one guy, maybe a handful of people. But where are the Sergio Moros of Mexico? Where are the Sergio Moros of Argentina, of Colombia, and so on and so forth? So
I would say on the hope side, it's mostly about the fundamentals in LATAM, which actually are improving. I mean, the emerging market asset class in 2013, when everything blew up. No? Oh, okay. Better? Yeah, okay. So in 2013, when the last time all these currencies imploded, the current account deficit of the asset class outside of China was $60 billion. And now we have a $10 billion surplus. So I think the external imbalances, which typically I think are the key sort of vulnerability, really improved a lot. Growth, I mean, this year for the first in a long time, most markets, most countries will grow more than last year. I think the exceptions are Mexico, Turkey, and maybe there's one more in Asia. But growth is quite broad right now. And it's still, the improvement in growth is quite broad. It's still way below where we want it to be, but it's going in the right direction. LATAM is the only region where there's still disinflation. And you have inflation rising in Asia and CEMEA. In LATAM, it's still falling. So overall, I think it's sort of domestically a fairly good picture. The problem is, of course, and that's where the fears come in, it's largely global. I mean, China is always there. People start to worry in 2004 about China, and nothing major has happened, but eventually it, of course, will. And I don't think collectively investors have a very good sense of the timing of that, so that fear just remains and gets pushed back or forward, but it's always there. And other than that, I think obviously, the general politics, global politics are a problem, and they could leak over into LATAM. I think right now LATAM is almost the only region where politics have improved, are improving, and are basically a positive factor. But that doesn't have to stay that way. I mean, a lot of these populist trends are very global. They could arrive again in Latin America. They could arrive in Mexico next year. And so that, I think, is a big fear, that the reaction to the increased populism in the US mostly, you will see changes in the political landscape in Latin America as well. Maybe I'll do that.
So let me explore some of the issues that were raised, and let's start by Manuel in China. Because you raised the issue that Latin America has only grown around 3% over the past decade per year, and that is in spite of having a growing China, huge imports of commodities, and commodities at a good price. So what makes you think that we can continue growing at 3% with the specter of China not growing, commodity prices going down, and adding to this the possibility of interest rates going up?
Yeah, the 3% is an average over periods, any period, since 1990 till 2000, 2000 till 2010, it's almost 3%, 2.9, 3.1, but it's, that doesn't mean that Latin America has grown at 3%. Latin America before the crisis, when China was growing at 9%, Latin America was growing at 5.5%. So, number one, Latin America can grow more. The problem is we had crisis in the 80s, which was almost a decade lost. We had crisis in the early 90s, in the late 90s, in the early 2000s, in the mid 2007 or 2008 or 2009, and in 2014 till last year, in Latin America, I mean. So The problem, those averages, sometimes you get 5 and change, and sometimes you get -1 or whatever, which was last year. So it's very irregular. So that's the other thing you have to get ready whenever you go to the real world is be ready, put your seatbelts on, and be ready for, because it's not a one-way street in Latin America. So commodities are going up because the world is growing better, it's growing more. Slow, still grows at 1.5 less than was growing pre-crisis, but it's growing better every year, and I think that will continue. China seems to be stable, so the demand is there for commodities. And countries like Mexico, and we haven't talked about the fear of protectionism and all those issues, and I know that it's going to come. Countries like Mexico depend much more on the US, and US, it's at two sides of the same coin. On one side, the US will become more protectionist, it's a fact, but US is growing better, which is good for Mexico. So my sense is, with commodities going up, with a little better politicians in the region, with currencies being much more competitive. Currency has devaluated in average in the region by 30-something%. All of that makes the companies in Latin America and Latin America as a whole more competitive, and that's what we are seeing in the growth, and that's why it's growing. Can Latin America go back to grow at 5.5%? I hope so. It needs it. And I wouldn't be that negative with Latin America with that 3% growth. Over the last 20 years, Latin America has almost tripled its GDP in that period. Of 600 million people in the region, 600 and change, 70 million people have become from what is considered lower class to middle class. So there has been an improvement in Latin America. And GDP growth in the region, per capita GDP growth, has grown around 2.5% over the last 20 years, with Chile at the top that grew 2.5 times. Chile 4.5 times, and Brazil on the other end, which is a big country, 1.5 times the GDP per capita. That is very low. So there are good things happening in some countries. There is improvement in Latin America. Latin America is not the bankrupt region that used to be. We export capital. So there are many good things going. So if we don't have a big global surprise, I think Latin America is going to grow better, at least for the next 2 or 3 years. Then I don't know.
Let me put a related but different question for Renato, which is, assuming that Latin America doesn't grow on the base of commodities or not at the rate that it was growing before, of course it means that it has to grow industry and services. And you have been looking closely at the issue of whether we have the institutional and legal basis for capital markets and for corporate stability. Which of these countries are better off? Where is how well positioned is Latin America to grow in its capital markets and corporate structure?
Sure. So we have to I guess, to answer your question, we have to understand the fundamentals, what's going on and what makes a country grow. Labor, capital, productivity. Okay. So what's going on in labor? Education, critical for labor. Where are educational standards in Latin America and how have they progressed over the past 20 years? Okay.
Not well.
Not very good.
Yeah.
Okay. Labor standards, mobility of labor force. How can you move from a low income to a middle income to a high income person? Okay. Latin America has been notoriously bad at that. I mean, I guess the biggest example is why so many of us come to the United States. You have much more mobility in terms of labor mobility. Okay. I'm just highlighting the points. I mean, this is a problem, but also an opportunity, right? An opportunity for us to work on improving education, work on improving social classes in Latin America, which will eventually lead to what? much better security. What is the biggest problem in Mexico today? Insecurity. I mean, you have gangs, you have narcos. Why? A lot of times it's because if you go to the villages in Mexico, there's no job. The only job is a guy who drives in a BMW with a gun in his belt and says, you want to work for me, you're going to have all the money you want, you're going to be able to do everything you want. So the first point is capital, labor. So labor, I think there's a lot that we can do in terms of labor in Latin America. Second is capital. And here on capital, we have to look at what is the base of the infrastructure that we have in Latin America. Roads, airports, ports. How are we developing the region? And most of the times, for many of the countries, the development of most of the infrastructure is years past. I think Mexico probably is an outlier there. They rebuild a lot of the roads for exports to the United States after the first NAFTA agreement was approved in 23 years ago. Colombia now has a plan for infrastructure. Brazil has a plan, but has anyone traveled on the roads in Brazil? I mean, the other day I was with a very large producer of soya beans in Brazil, and he was telling me that it costs more to move soya beans from Mato Grosso to a port than to a port to China. Okay, so when we look at capital and why isn't Latin America growing at 7-8% that it should, is because the investment has been misdirected. The size of the equity markets. We heard about entrepreneurs. I mean, if you are an entrepreneur, one of the way out is to list your company. The number of IPOs that we have seen coming out of Latin America, very small. So we need to develop that. The pension fund system. Chile has an amazing pension fund system if Bachelet doesn't start changing it. Okay. But by the way, I mean, the Chilean pension fund system used to be a model for the world. So we can innovate. We can lead the world in so many things. But so capital, I think we have to look at capital structures in Latin America. And there again, there are tremendous inefficiencies, which are opportunities. And finally, productivity. When you start to look at labor and capital and how these are applied, you start to see the gaps. So I wish I could say that I could see Latin America growing at 7-8% over the next decade or so, but unfortunately I cannot say that because we don't have the government in place that is worried about some of these structural issues, that really want to fix it. Unfortunately, we still have a system that is tremendously corrupt in many countries in Latin America, where impunity continues to exist, and this needs to change. So when we talk about the bottom of the pyramid, we need to fix the entire pyramid structure in the region. Can we grow at a 3.5% for the next decade? Yes. And will this be with ups and downs, as we saw with Brazil over the past decade? Probably, until we start to address the much more structural issues that are much more long-term in nature, that no politician will see an impact on his political or her political campaign for the next election, but for the country is the issue for the long term.
Let me just add a quick thing. I think what you said is exactly right, but it's a hard way to grow, right? There's an easy way to grow, which is basically either exports or credit booms. And those are the two ways that 90% of small open economies typically grow, right? Because your way is the hard way. And that easy way just won't work anymore, right? Because we probably will enter a fairly protectionist world. And so the trade, and maybe trade is more suppressed right now than it will be in some sort of medium term, but it will just not come back to the sort of trade growth numbers that we had in the past decade, right? So the trade way out will be much more difficult, and the credit boom will be much more difficult too, because the leverage hasn't really been unwound yet from the last credit boom. So I'm somewhat pessimistic. Just the two easy ways won't happen, and the hard way is a hard way. So remains to be seen.
Yeah, I actually, putting sort of the three things together, it's sort of interesting because when you look at the prospect for growth, of course, if you could just get higher commodity prices and export some more, it'll grow quite quickly. But unfortunately, the point that Renato was raising, which is the issue about inequality and education take a time. You know, there's no way that you can increase the educational level of a country. It takes a generation. It takes a generation, even with very good policies. And
but it's not impossible. Singapore did it.
Yeah.
Singapore used to be, you know, one of the poorest countries in Asia, and today has one of the highest income per capita.
Yes. And it takes a national commitment to do it. I mean, also, if you look at what Korea did to develop itself, basically it's education. It's probably one of the best educated countries in the world. But one of the tests that I always ask in my classes, when I see, you know, when I talk about education in Latin America, I always ask my Latin American students, how many of you went to a public school? And I have still to meet the first student that goes to a public school in Latin America and makes it to a Columbia MBA. So basically, that makes the issue of inequality sort of eternal. Oh, I forgot to put it up, sorry. Happens to me in class, which is more embarrassing. So, doesn't go off. Sorry for that. It always happens at the most inconvenient time. So it actually, you know, sort of points the spectrum of, you know, how possible is it to grow at a high rate if we don't commit to solve the issues that Renato was pointing out. And as Dirk was saying, there is no easy way out without solving the issue, at least the issue of education inequality and the issue of infrastructure, which also takes a high level of investment and you know, some years of commitment. Now, let me take probably the only unbiased person that we have here, which is Dirk, because the rest of us are Latin American. So, and if you take all of these considerations in, which are the countries in Latin America about which you are more positive for the coming decade? And do you see sort of glimmers of hope?
Well, we usually deal with the next 6 weeks, not with the next decade. But I mean, I would say the big improvements come with big political changes, right? And I mean, you know, there are not very many basket cases left where you can get a big improvement, but one is obviously Venezuela, right? And again, I'm not offering a strong view here, but at least you can see very easy fixes, right? Very easy fixes. The other countries are on the way. Many of them have, of course, made those political changes, and they are therefore, you know, some of the low-hanging fruit I think has already sort of happened. And you now worry, in the case of Mexico, of some backsliding on the politics, and I think it's a very serious worry that might well happen. I think next year's Brazil election will be very contentious if they don't grow much more than they're growing right now. So again, there you can, I mean, I think other than Venezuela, there's a clear path to improvement if you make the right political choice. All the other countries, if anything, are already having a pretty good political system where you have, in many places, a risk of backsliding, actually.
Now let's talk a little bit about the elephant in the room that Manuel brought out, which is, you know, what might happen with the changes of the Trump administration in Mexico and the rest of Latin America. And, you know, not only from the Mexican perspective, I think we sort of have to look at it from the Mexican perspective, from the Central American perspective, from the rest of Latin America perspective, because it sort of has impact in different degrees. So if you're going to look at the specter for Mexico, and if you were sort of advising the Mexican government, how do you see the Mexican situation right now, and what can Mexico do to sort of protect its economic growth going forward?
So there are two issues, right, the Mexicans are facing. One is NAFTA renegotiation, and one is the US tax reform. NAFTA is obviously directly targeting Mexico because with Canada, you know, there's no trade deficit, so therefore no one cares in Washington about Canada. So the tax is, of course, global in that it would hurt any import from any country. But, you know, Mexico is exporting 26% of GDP to the US. And that is, I mean, a huge, standout. I mean, the next highest export levels are in emerging Asia, and they're somewhere between 4% of GDP and 6 or 7% of GDP. So clearly, even if it's a global impact from US tax reform, it mostly hits Mexico. And so far, actually, the Mexicans are, not negotiating that poorly, I don't think. I mean, they try to wrap it all up together with immigration and with security and try to make one big package deal out of it, and they might have some success. It's a bit hard to tell because there are so many voices inside the Trump administration. It's hard to tell who is really speaking for the president and who actually knows what's going on. But that's what they're trying. And in the end, it's very, very difficult, right? Because you are a little bit the sort of, the skinny kid on the schoolyard. I mean, it's hard to pick a fight with China because all hell will break loose if you pick a fight with China. With Mexico, the US can pick a fight without getting into too much trouble. So the temptation is to pick on Mexico. I think what Mexico can do, and I think what they're sort of trying to do is, if the majority of the Republicans in the Senate is very slim, right? It's just 2 or 3 votes. And so if you manage to sort of convince 2 or 3 Republican senators that's not a good idea to go after Mexico because they have strong interests in their state that benefit from trade with Mexico, then it presumably is possible to make sure there are not enough votes in the Senate to get sort of terrible Mexico legislation through. So that is probably what is happening and what they're trying to do. And I think there are some odds of them being relatively successful. I'm personally not that much worried about the NAFTA negotiations. I think it will, in the end, presumably a deal everyone can live with. The US tax reform, I think, would be, harder to stall maybe, and also it could be more disruptive, but it would not be mostly against Mexico. It would be a global issue, I think.
So, what are the main issues between Mexico and the United States that should be addressed? NAFTA has been approved by a Republican government, was negotiated under President Bush, was finally implemented under President Clinton. What many people don't know is when it was implemented by President Clinton, there were a lot of side letters that needed to be agreed by Mexico that were demands of the United States in order for President Clinton to approve NAFTA. And some of those side letters had to do with commerce, restricting commerce sometimes in some areas like agriculture goods that were coming into the US in order to protect, be it the sugarcane producers in Hawaii or the orange growers in Florida or the strawberry growers or the tomato growers in California and so on and so forth. But also other issues. For Mexico, obviously, a lot of, and let me just break this down into 2 things. What are some of the key priorities that the Trump administration has so far shown? I would divide them into 3 areas. One is fiscal, the other one is stimulus policies, and the third one is foreign policy. There's been a lot of focus on the foreign policy side, and obviously building a wall and deporting immigrants and all the things that we are hearing. If I were advising the Mexican government, the first thing that I would say is that we have to take the North American Free Trade Agreement and make this into a comprehensive North American integration agreement that will go much beyond just a trade agreement. And by integration, you can therefore start to address issues like immigration, like more general borders between Canada, Mexico, and the United States. The funny thing is, if you look at the number of Mexicans that are crossing into the United States, the number is actually negative. There are more Mexicans moving back to Mexico than coming to the US. There are a lot more Central Americans coming to the United States through Mexico than Mexicans coming to the United States. So if I was advising the Mexican government, I would move this from a trade agreement into an integration agreement, and then you can start protecting the southern border of Mexico and protect that entrance. So that's on the immigration side. On the trade side, if you look at the trade agreement and you start decomposing the trade agreement between Mexico and the US, you see that the majority of it, probably 70 to 80%, is the auto industry. And these auto parts that are produced in Canada, the United States, sent to Mexico. They are assembled into maquiladoras, in Mexico, and then they are re-exported. So there's a net number there that, or there is an overall number there that probably is not totally clear, not totally fair, because some of these goods are produced in the three countries. And finally, so I think they have to understand that this agreement has been in place for 23 years. There are companies that have made decisions to invest, be it on the financial sector, be it on the manufacturing sector, be it on the services sector, education and so on and so forth, between the three countries, and you cannot just dismantle that. So I will try to take this in a much more productive way. There are over 6 million jobs that have been created in the United States because of NAFTA, for instance. So there's a lot of positives. And finally, I think the big lesson for Mexico is that Mexico shouldn't rely only on the United States. And as a trading partner, it's a country that has so many trading partnerships already, free trading partnerships. And Mexico should try to develop a lot more its local industry. And it has the potential to do it. It's attracting car manufacturers from Toyota to BMW, Audi, and so on and so forth. Why not develop the engineers? Why not develop the technicians? Why not develop the companies that will produce small parts for those automakers? So I think there's a lot there that Mexico can do. And the trade agreement, I agree with Dirk. I think it will be negotiated. It will be hard. That's very clear. I mean, everyone is going to pull la sábana para su lado. But it's Mexico has a lot to offer, and it's 3,000 kilometers of border. It's integration. It's a friendly country, and I think the hard fight. And by the way, I'm just going to finish with this and pass it to Manuel. I think the U.S. administration is just warming up with Mexico. The big fight is yet to come with China. You look at the trade balance number, the trade deficit with Mexico is in the order of $50 billion. The trade deficit with China is $350 billion. So,
yeah, I agree 100% with that. I think what Renato said, Mexico trade with the U.S. Is approximately the same size that China trade with the U.S. But the deficit with Mexico is 60 billion or 50 to 60 billion, so it's around 12% of the total trade. In China, it's the same level of trade, but it's 320, 350 billion, which is 60% of the total trade. So the real issue for the US, if protectionism is the name of the game, is not Mexico, number one. Second, 23-year-old agreement is an old agreement. I think it's obsolete. I think it has to be changed and will be negotiated. And it will be approved not only by Republicans. I think some Democrats also will approve it because the whole Sanders group also will approve any of those changes. So it's going to be negotiated. I think it's going to have a lot of short-term impact, noise. I don't think we'll have long-term impact in Mexico and the relationship between Mexico and the US. And I think that Mexico that exports today around 70% of its exports or 80% are manufactured goods, and 80% of those go to the US. I don't think that will change very much because they cannot go to China because China is their main competitor to go to the US. So I don't see a big change in this whole thing. Yes, the conditions are going to be a little worse for Mexico than before. It's not a game changer. My concern with Mexico is the political situation that Mexico is today and the elections that Mexico has in the next election, and that has a name, which is AMLO, and that's the risk that Mexico has. I think that hopefully for the Mexicans and the Americans, this negotiation is smooth without much noise because politically it's a major issue. It's much easier to explain for Trump that the Mexicans are taking your jobs, the Mexican immigrants, and Mexico, because the Americans understand that, the middle class American understands that, than the Chinese. It's easy politically. That's why it makes a lot of noise, and that's why he's using it a lot. But I don't see that the big change. So it's going to be change, but I don't think there's going to be a killer for Mexico. The question with Mexico, what is going to happen in their elections and how Mexico goes from here. We had huge hopes on the current president. We believe that Peña Nieto was really going to make big changes. They did and approved a series of changes that were very refreshing. But because of corruption, because of many issues, it has gone nowhere. Then it was hit by all this political noise and other issues, but there are fundamental issues in Mexico that has to be resolved in Mexico. So my sense on protectionism, and that was one of the questions they sent us before the panel, will it change a lot in Latin America? I don't see it, because the rest of Latin America ex-Mexico really exports most of it. The rest of Latin America ex-Mexico only exports 13% of their products to Mexico. 70% of their exports are commodities. So I don't think protectionism is going to affect that very much. It might affect marginally, but very marginally. To Mexico, it affects it more, but again, I don't think it's going to affect it that much. I think today, except that there is a major issue with China, the future in Latin America in the next few years and the growth of Latin America depends on us, on Latin Americans. I don't think we will be able to blame it, or we can blame it on Trump, or we can blame it on any other politician. I think it's our politicians, it's our rule of laws, it's our corruption, it's many of the things that Renato mentioned. Having said all that, I think something is being done. We hear a lot of it because for the first time, it's not like it's happening now and it didn't happen before. So I'm positive, I'm eternally positive. I created a business because you never go into a business, don't ever be an entrepreneur if you are not positive, because believe me, there's gonna be many rocks in the road, but it depends on us. I don't know if that's to the whole.
I think maybe one, I mean, I totally agree with what you said on the politics in Mexico, but one interesting twist, I think, is that what seems to happen is that governments get punished for doing the right thing, right? I mean, it's not just corruption why he's unpopular. It's, the VAT hike used to be unpopular. The gasoline hike is extremely unpopular. So whenever you do these fiscal reforms that are a good thing, that's what's causing these, or it's one of the causes anyway, for these approval ratings to really tank. Same with Dilma. I mean, when she was doing all the wrong things, she was quite popular. In her second term, she started to improve actually on the margin, right? She tried to bring in a good finance minister, and then all hell broke loose, and her ratings tanked. So I think it's an endogenous problem of this whole process that good politicians doing the right things lead to, to worse ratings and to change again. I think that is exactly the risk in Mexico for next year, as you point out.
Yeah. The only thing is bad politicians are even worse. Meaning, Look, I agree, these politicians last between 4 and 5 years. Many times in Latin America, when we come in, like look at Macri right now, you have to take measures that are not popular because you have to increase tariffs, electric tariffs, water tariffs, etc., which the population doesn't like, but it's the only way you will attract new investment, and if not, you don't have electricity. So there are many things that you have to do. What Temer is doing, he has to reduce expenditure that is not positive for growth in a country that is already not growing. You have to increase taxes because you have to collect more in order to balance the fiscal deficit. So I agree with you. Good politics is not easy, but bad politicians make more damage than good politicians. And look, the people are not that dumb. People end up reacting to their bad decisions. So you see how potentially, hopefully, Sebastián Piñera will be re-elected in Chile as president, and it's a reaction. When he went out, he wasn't that popular. But people now see what's the difference between that and what we had the last 3 years, and look, it was much better. So I think there are reactions to that as people get more educated. The middle class in Latin America used to be 20%, today is 30%. As education grows slowly, I agree, but as it improves, people start voting better and electing better candidates, and more decent people come. It comes in cycles. I think we are starting to see a new cycle of positive politicians in Latin America, and you see it in Argentina, you see it in Brazil, you see it in Peru, you hopefully will see it in Chile, hopefully we will see what happens in the next election in Mexico, Brazil, etc. But I think there is better hope. The Chavezes of this world are in some way not very liked, not that popular. I remember the time when the foreign minister of Colombia was complaining to us, a group of people, saying, how can it be that we arrived to the United Nations, the Uribe team, and then the Chavez team, and Chavez team was by far more popular than Uribe's team. It's true. And that, I think, it's not popular in the United Nations by all the United Nations
by the media.
delegates. Huh?
The media.
No, not the media, the delegates. I think that is not the case today. I think people have realized what Chavez can do and what Maduro can do and what Uribe and Santos can do. So, I don't know, I have hope.
So you think that we're growing up? Because you think that we're growing up? Because that's basically an issue of political maturity, of being able to sort of...
I'm sure we are growing up. Latin America today, with all the bad things we say, it's a much better region. Latin America in the 80s was bankrupt. Latin America in the 80s was an importer of capital. Today we export capital. Today we have very good competitive companies in Latin America that are global competitors. Look at the World Economic Forum analysis of the global champions. You see many Latin American companies there. So there is a change. It doesn't happen over time. Education is a big issue. Corruption is a big issue. Infrastructure is a big issue, but it has to be tackled. My recommendation to you over the next 20 years or 30 years, which is your work career, focus on those areas, because those are the areas that we need to focus. I focus on the finance. We don't create much. We move money around, etc. It's better if you educate people, you give healthcare to people. You don't need to be a doctor. You can create a healthcare operation and work in infrastructure. Latin America has to improve in that. I think there are good projects. I think everybody's talking about it. Few is being done, but some things are done. We are all, we included, creating infrastructure funds, etc., financed by local money. So there are things going on. So there is improvement.
I was actually going to add something to something that Manuel said, because aside from the fact of getting to education, getting to health, which is, getting to public service, the other day I was with a friend of mine who's Brazilian. I was with a bunch of my Brazilian friends, and they're all, of course, complaining about Dilma and the governments, the politicians. And this guy turned around and said, have any of you really gotten involved in politics or public service? Nobody had. And this was a relatively good group. And he said, we're basically leaving this country to incompetence. If we, who are probably the best educated people in this country, do not get involved in politics, what can we expect? And I think one of the big differences in countries like Colombia is that actually you do see some of the best people in the country.
But by the way, on that point that you are making, which is an amazing point, I joke because I'm 54 years old, so I'm old now. Many of my friends that I grew up with, that I knew in Citibank, Santander, and in my time at Compass, they are involved and has been involved with government. Latin America, people are in Chile during the Piñera time. Look, there was a joke saying, "Hey, come and visit us because the owners of the country are going to receive you." Because there were a lot of people in the ministers, etc., that they were never a politician. In Argentina today, you see the Macri group is impressive. Believe me, it's impressive group of people that is you guys that were here for a while, that went back there, and they're trying to improve their country. They're not doing it because they're making a lot of money. They're doing it because they really, at this age, they're willing to help. You see it in Peru with PPK. You see it with Macri. You will see it again with Piñera if he comes back. You see it in some extent in Mexico with Peña Nieto. There is a corruption issue and shadow always there, but so I think that also gives hope.
Now let me get, I'm going to get into two related issues. The first one is, Manuel mentioned, and it's true, when you look back at Latin America, every time that it seemed like we were doing well, some crisis came and we collapsed again. And of course, at this point, we had debt crisis, financial crisis. It generally had to do with some type of economic mismanagement. The question is, right now, if we look at the major Latin American economies, can we weather the storm if, let's say, China doesn't grow, commodities sort of, continue at a fairly low price, interest rates in the world go up? Are we fairly solid on the economic front in the sense of having, sufficient reserves and sufficient sane economic management that we're not going to see, the next crisis?
Me?
Yeah.
When we look at Latin America this year, for instance, what we are estimating is that every country is going to grow faster than last year, with the exception of Mexico and Venezuela, which continues to implode, okay, of the major countries in Latin America. And Mexico is an interesting one, because if you think about it, there's always a correlation between the GDP of Mexico and the GDP of the US. And this year, that correlation is failing. We are expecting the US growth to accelerate more than 1% from about 1.5 to about 2.5, but for Mexico to slow down. Okay. Having said that, the fundamentals you mentioned, the level of international reserves, some of the macro numbers, some of the Latin American countries are coming out of crises. Argentina is one example. Brazil is another example. So for a lot of countries, the macroeconomic conditions are much better. But having said that, we are not immune. If we do go into a situation where China has a major growth problem, where we have a major transformation of U.S. trade flows, which is possible, not only because of NAFTA being renegotiated, but more importantly, this border adjustment tax that is being proposed by Congress, which will impact everyone, not a single country. So the point is, we are in a much better position today in the region, but we are not immune, and capital would fly out relatively fast if we do see an implosion of China, if we do see an implosion of Europe. By the way, I think China is a big problem. I think Europe is another big problem that a lot of people are today completely ignoring. We have elections in the Netherlands in about 15 days. A candidate that wants to expel all Muslims from the Netherlands. That's his campaign promise.
There's another one.
We have elections in France, where a leading candidate wants to take France out of the euro. We have elections in Germany, where again, things seem that the status quo will be challenged. So we have the UK, which, let's put it as it is, decided to move out of the EU. Why? Because of immigration. Because they did not want to accept the same level of refugees that everyone else in the EU was accepting. Okay? It's so the world is very different, and it is changing very quickly. Not only in the U.S., in Europe, in a lot of countries, and I think it's becoming very, very dangerous. Okay, so if we do have a major economic crisis, Latin America will probably be not the epicenter of that crisis, but it's not immune to it.
Let me relate that and start to link it with some of the questions that have come from. Let me relate that to some of the questions that have been brought up, and I'm going to relate this to sort of the second question, which is because you're talking about the rise of sort of populist and in some ways authoritarian governments throughout the world, and then somebody in the audience raised the question, if you look at how the Asian tigers, and this is true for Korea, this is true for Taiwan, this is true for Singapore, at the time in which they developed, these were one-party authoritarian regimes. So the question is, do we need single-party authoritarian regimes to develop? And is there some reason behind trying to become stronger governments and stronger authoritarian governments, or is that sort of a poor recipe? That's the second question. Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Chile is mentioned there, Manuel.
Yeah, and it's anonymous. Of Chile. It's easy. Look, I'm not anonymous. I agree 100% with that. Not that you need authoritarian governments. You need very organized governments, very well structured. Look at Singapore. You use the example of Singapore. It's far from a democratic government, or what did change in Singapore. Chile, the big miracle in changing from a completely useless country into a competitive country was done in an authoritarian rule. That doesn't mean that it needs to be a dictator doing it, because you can get a good dictator, a bad dictator, good policies, bad policies. I don't believe that that's the policy. You do need authority and the ability to do things, and very committed to do those things. It's hard to do it when you are the president and all the Senate or the Congress is from the opposite party, because then it stops everything you do. So clearly, a good commitment to do things, clear ideas of what to do, and an ability to do it is crucial. Do you need an authoritarian government? I don't know. Maybe what you need is some balance between what the president wants to do and what the Congress lets him to do. That's my feeling. I don't think we are going to have that in Latin America. I don't think authoritarian governments is the way to go, except Venezuela, and you see the example of what is happening there. I'm married with a Venezuelan, so so believe me, I'm close to that. But in many ways, yeah, we need politicians that are very straightforward. Macri, I think, has it. Macri is trying to do it. It's not easy, but he tries to convince people, and if he convinces enough people, the Congress has to let him do it. Piñera, I think if he comes the second government with much more focus in what he wants to do, he would be able to do it. It's not always the case in other countries. PPK, I think, is trying to do it, and is really trying to put it in place, and he has very clear ideas what he wants to do. Again, I bet for those people that they will be not 100% successful, but 70% successful, and that makes a huge change. Doesn't mean they will be re-elected, or in some cases cannot be re-elected because of the local laws, but I think that people start seeing, and this new created middle class, better educated people start seeing that that made a bigger change than this populist rhetoric that some other governments come with.
If I can just add one thing. For me, one of the major issues for development or preventing development is rule of law. Okay, you could have the best intentioned politician, but that politician is going to deal with the Congress, with the legislative, and even in the executive. If there is no rule of law, and I think that's what was one of the big differences between Chile and every other country in Latin America, the police works. It's much harder to try to pay a policeman in Chile. You're going to end up in jail. I mean, everywhere else in Latin.
That's why Odebrecht wasn't in Chile. They didn't win one contract.
But to me, that's a critical thing. Sorry, so just to add.
And I would just add one thing. I think it must depend on the stage of development of a country, right? Because the SMP performs the best when there's gridlock in Congress, actually. So I think the US presumably has reached a level of government where the best outcome is government does nothing, which is obviously not the case for some place in Latin America. So I agree on that.
It's actually interesting when you look at the Asian tigers. They were actually enlightened authoritarian regimes. I mean, they got lucky in a way. But the one thing that was true among all of them is that once they got to be middle-income economies, they started to become democracies. And there is no single country that has developed beyond middle income if it is not a democracy. And that's actually one of the big issues in China, is that there's a big doubt as to whether China can continue to be, as closed as it is in the sense of the way of government, and actually develop more economically. So,
there is always some truth behind some jokes, and I always joke that socialists love to have a very uneducated population. And it's true behind that, because it's almost like it's the best way to convince them that they will do things that they can never do. The challenge then, it goes back to what Renato mentioned: educate people and bring them up in the social classes. If business people, you guys, whenever you go and become a business person in any of these countries, just worry about your bottom line and nothing about the rest, it's a very short-term equation. And that was a problem in Latin America for a very long time. I think business people in Latin America are starting to realize that. Politicians are starting to realize that. And the big fight today is how to educate the people, because whenever those people are educated, they can discriminate between a bad idea from a good idea, a empty promise from a full promise, or somewhat full promise. And I think that's the big challenge in the region. I'm hopeful, and I think there is an improvement, and people are willing to discriminate, but we will continue having good and bad politicians, and we will continue having those cycles.
Hopefully they just get better.
I think we're running out of time,
Yeah.
right? So my last word to you guys is one word: values. Live by your values. You are privileged to have come to the United States to study, to be here, okay? And you're going to have an opportunity to go back to your countries or to stay here and develop your careers here. And I think what makes or breaks you are going to be your values. So just keep that in mind as you go through life. Thank you.
So I want to thank all of you for participating. Hopefully, all of you are a little bit more enlightened about the good and the bad side of Latin America, but hopefully you're even more inspired to be part of the solution as opposed to be just part of criticizing the problem. Yeah, so, and I think, as summary here said, actually, even though Latin America has been growing slowly, it has been growing at a pretty steady pace. And if we actually do the right things, we have much better basis for growth now than we had 10 and 20 years ago. We had better educated people, we have better governments, we have all the sort of a little bit of each of the fundamentals. We just need to sort of put them on steroids.
Not too much steroids. So.